In a dusty corner of Windsor Castle, a discovery shatters the silence, a final handwritten note by Queen Elizabeth II, sealed in a velvet pouch and buried among her most intimate belongings. But what no one expected, Camilla is mentioned by name. Who found it? Why was it hidden? And what did the Queen want the world to know after her death? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began quietly, far from the eyes of the public. After Queen Elizabeth's funeral had faded into the echoes of history and the black veils had been lifted from Britain's grieving heart, a discreet team was assigned the unenviable task of combing through her private estate. Among the keepsakes, portraits, and meticulously archived correspondence lay a drawer that hadn't been touched in decades. Its lock was old but royal sealed, a sign that its contents were never meant for casual eyes. When it creaked open, what emerged was not just paper. It was a secret. A letter. A note written in the Queen's unmistakable hand, delicate but determined, and sealed in deep crimson wax bearing the royal arms. Across the top, scrawled in fading ink, were the chilling words, "To be opened when the silence is too loud." At first the aides thought it might have been a draft of an old speech, or perhaps a forgotten address to the Commonwealth. But as one senior staff member peeled the wax open and read just the first line, a gasp was heard, followed by silence. And then, a thud. The staffer had fainted. When they recovered, their hands were trembling, and they could only utter one thing: Camilla. She wrote about Camilla. That was when everything changed. The note was immediately secured. Guards were summoned, phones were confiscated, and within an hour the room was placed under an unofficial royal lockdown. No one was to speak of what they saw. No one was to repeat what they read. Sworn to silence, bound by loyalty or perhaps fear, those who were present have barely whispered a word since. But some details, like water through stone, began to leak. The Queen's handwriting had been authenticated, no forgery, no dictation. These were her words, her thoughts, her judgment. And they weren't kind. The name Camilla appeared more than once, underlined in thick strokes as if the pen itself had trembled under the weight of emotion. This wasn't the measured voice of a monarch issuing royal decrees. This was Elizabeth, the woman, the widow, the mother, the Queen who had seen her family both rise and unravel. And she had waited until death to unburden herself. Why? That is the question burning through every hallway of the palace. In the hours that followed, whispers turned into urgent calls. Senior members of the royal household convened in hushed meetings, faces pale with disbelief. What did it mean for the monarchy? For Charles? For Camilla, now queen consort in title but suddenly not in spirit? There were calls to burn the note. Others argued it had to be preserved. It was history after all. But behind every argument, one truth loomed too large to ignore. Elizabeth had written those words not for herself, but for someone, perhaps many. And if Camilla was named, then others surely were too. Each line of the note, every choice of phrase, every name underlined was a ripple in what might become a royal storm. But as whispers ripple through the palace walls, another question looms large. Who was this note really meant for? Behind the royal smiles and ceremonial parades, Queen Elizabeth bore wounds the world never saw. In the final months of her life, isolated and contemplative, her journey, Alice revealed a mind haunted by legacy and betrayal. Camilla was not just a passing thought, she was a fixation. After Prince Philip's death, something shifted in Her Majesty. To the public, she remained composed, graceful, an unwavering symbol of stability. But inside the palace, whispers told a different story. The Queen, once a pillar of quiet strength, began to unravel not in scandal, but in silence. She cancelled meetings you would have never missed. She spent entire mornings alone in her private quarters, declining even the presence of her closest staff. Those who had served her loyally for decades began to notice the change. She was fading, not only in health but in trust. Trust in those around her, in the future of her lineage, and most hauntingly, in the very institution she had fought her whole life to protect. Sources close to her revealed a pattern of behavior that began shortly after Philip's passing, a tendency to write furiously in the dead of night, locking pages way before dawn. These writings, some barely legible, were filled with sharp reflections, unfinished thoughts, and cryptic references. Staff reportedly found a drawer stuffed with scraps and leather-bound notebooks. One of the recurring signatures? A solitary letter, C. No explanation. Just that single initial. But in the context of the Queen's escalating detachment and the tension that began to thicken around succession talks, it didn't take long before those closest to her began to draw a chilling connection. She referred to a phrase again and again, Windsor risk. It appeared in the margins of her musings, underlined twice, sometimes written beside names. Camilla's was among them. She had once publicly accepted Camilla, or so it seemed. But in her solitude, with Philip gone and her own time visibly limited, Elizabeth seemed to be at war with that decision. According to leaked notes, she feared history repeating itself, a fractured monarchy, public rebellion, a scandal-cloaked smiles. She worried, above all, that her legacy would be reshaped by those who didn't carry her same reverence for duty, who saw the crown not as a service, but as a stage. Even her final Christmas speech, one that was seen as reflective and poignant, now appears, in retrospect, to have been steeped in subtle warnings. The references to the weight of responsibility, unseen sacrifices and remaining true, even when the world moves quickly past you, were not, as many thought, abstract sentiments. They were code, layers of restrained sorrow and disappointment, hidden beneath a polished delivery. A monarch's last attempt to speak freely without igniting fire. But she hadn't said everything she wanted. That would come later in the note that shook the monarchy to its core. And yet, the Queen's pain didn't emerge in speeches, it came to life in ink, with revelations that now threatened the very image of the royal family. She is not to be crowned in my name. These 9 words, a leg, Edley scrawled in the margin of the Queen's note, have ignited a firestorm. Camilla, the once silenced figure in Charles's shadow, now stands at the heart of the Queen's final judgment. But why such a direct condemnation? For years, the public was led to believe that Queen Elizabeth had made peace with Camilla's growing role in the monarchy. She had formally acknowledged her, appeared beside her at key events, and even sanctioned her future title as Queen Consort. But behind closed doors, the warmth was never quite there. It was, according to those who served the Queen privately, a calculated truce, not a heartfelt reconciliation. Elizabeth was a woman of duty, bound to appearances, but her silence spoke louder than words, and in her final note, that silence erupted. Multiple senior courtiers, speaking under strict anonymity, described years of frostiness, punctuated by forced smiles and steely distance. The Queen, they claim, never forgot what Camilla represented, not just to Diana, to the stability of the institution itself. After Megxit, when Harry and Meghan's departure cast a shadow over the monarchy, Camilla's actions reportedly widened the cracks. She became bolder, more visible, stepping into roles that had once belonged to others. Public sympathy that once leaned toward the Queen seemed to fracture as Camilla's influence behind palace walls intensified. Some insiders whisper that she began asserting herself in areas traditionally reserved for Elizabeth's private council, advising Charles, entertaining diplomats, even making comments that the Queen reportedly found inappropriate. One such moment, a joke made at a state dinner, allegedly led to a private rebuke from Elizabeth herself. But it didn't end there. Rumours of closed-door confrontations began to swirl. On more than one occasion, the Queen is said to have summoned Camilla privately. What was said remains locked behind royal lips, but what followed was unmistakable. Camilla's presence at certain events grew sparse for months. Elizabeth, never one for theatrical gestures, had delivered her message the only way she knew how, by pulling back the curtain without a word. And now, through the note she left behind, the depth of that resentment is impossible to deny. One line haunts those who've read it: "To forgive is not to forget." And I have not. It's raw, it's personal, and it reveals a monarch who, even on the edge of death, refused to bury a betrayal that had perhaps never healed. This wasn't just about titles or tradition. This was about control. Elizabeth had ruled for longer than most had lived, and to see her wishes sidestepped, her vision for the crown distorted, was a wound she could not endure silently. Some believe she felt overridden, her role as the ultimate moral compass of the monarchy diluted in her final years. That Camilla, despite everything, had been positioned to wear a crown tied to Elizabeth's name that was, to her, an unforgivable offence. And if this, Note was a reckoning. It was also a warning. Camilla may have risen, but not with the Queen's blessing, and that truth casts a shadow over every ceremony and smile that followed. But perhaps most shocking of all was what or who the Queen believed Camilla had endangered. William had always been her quiet strength, the grandson who carried the weight of legacy, not with loud ambition, but with steady grace. And it was in him that Elizabeth had placed her final hopes. She had watched him grow from a boy shattered by tragedy into a man molded by restraint. Yet even he, in her last writings, seemed caught in the crossfire. In the Queen's own words, William was the last thread of Windsor dignity. And what horrified her most, as the note revealed, was the creeping realization that Camilla's growing presence had not only reshaped the institution, it had begun to influence William's future. A future Elizabeth feared was slipping out of his control. Whispers within the palace hinted at PR. Private meetings between Camilla and senior advisors traditionally aligned with William's path. Proposals about modernizing the monarchy, subtle shifts in ceremonial roles, and the sudden urgency to prepare Charles's reign as a complete package. Camilla beside him, unchallenged, all sent tremors through Elizabeth's confidence. In one fragment of the note, Elizabeth wrote, "He will not be king of his own making, but of others' maneuvering." Many believe she was referring to William and the forces she saw aligning around him, forces she could no longer stop. And yet, her fear wasn't rooted solely in politics, it was personal. She saw in William a reflection of herself, quiet resolve, devotion to duty, and the ability to withstand public firestorms without ever unraveling. But Camilla's rise, in Elizabeth's eyes, introduced chaos disguised as charm. "She plays the part well," one line reads, "but she plays it for herself." That line, underlined twice in the margins, echoes the Queen's growing suspicion that loyalty within the family had turned transactional, and that the crown, if left unchecked, might evolve into a tool of self-interest, not public service. In the Queen's final days, as her strength waned and her voice grew softer, her pen grew bolder. She wrote, not out of bitterness, but as a final act of stewardship. Her note, now infamous, wasn't just an indictment of Camilla. It was a desperate plea to protect what she believed still remained pure in the monarchy, a crown passed not through favoritism or revisionist memory, but through earned grace and silent endurance. To Elizabeth, Camilla had not earned it, and in raising her, the institution had betrayed something sacred. It was in these reflections that the Queen's internal war raged, between tradition and transformation, between appearance and truth, and at the center of that war, the person who bore the greatest weight was William, the heir she had hoped would inherit not just her throne, but her cable, sense of duty. And as those reading the Queen's final words reached the lines written about William, one thing became undeniable: his fate too had been altered. And the Queen, even in death, had tried to steer him back. But what decision would he make, now that the note was no longer secret? For years, Kate Middleton has played the role of poised princess and supportive spouse. But behind the serene smile lies a steel resolve. After reading the Queen's note, sources claim Kate confronted Camilla in a moment that left the palace shaken. Her words? "You know what she thought of you." The public has always seen Catherine as composed, elegant, and dutiful. But what they never saw, what few even inside the palace fully grasped, was the quiet and deeply personal bond she shared with Queen Elizabeth. It wasn't forged in formalities or protocol, but in moments away from cameras, where titles were dropped and truth was spoken plainly. The Queen had once referred to her, it is claimed, as the only one who understands the weight, a remark that stunned those who overheard it. She saw in Kate not just a royal wife, but a woman who would one day steady the crown itself. So when the Queen's final note was revealed, filled with fury and heartbreak, it struck Kate deeper than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just a message from a monarch, it was a cry from a mentor. The confrontation that followed wasn't planned. In the days after the Queen's funeral, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Camilla, crowned in spirit if not yet in ceremony, moved with an unsettling ease through the corridors of power. But behind closed doors, the truth had already spread about the note, about what it said, and about who it condemned. According to palace insiders, Kate cornered Camilla during a brief reception, flanked only by senior aides. Witnesses say her voice never rose, but the words were unmistakably sharp. You know what she thought of you." The room fell into a stunned sigh. Lentz, and for once, Camilla had no response. That moment marked a shift. No longer was Kate merely standing behind William, she was stepping into the fire herself. Allegedly, she demanded that the Queen's final words be acknowledged, that the note be made public in some form, if not in full. She argued not just with emotion, but with principle. History should not be rewritten, especially not by those it condemned. Yet the resistance was swift. Courtiers advised silence. Charles was reportedly enraged. William, caught in the middle, was paralyzed, torn between his loyalty to his wife and his inherited duty to protect the fragile facade of unity. The fallout, though private, was seismic. Kate began skipping key public engagements. Whispers emerged that she was reconsidering her role entirely, not out of weakness but as protest. Those closest to her said she refused to play the part of smiling approval, while Camilla's coronation loomed, haunted by the knowledge of what the Queen truly felt. Her absence became its own kind of statement, a silent echo of Elizabeth's unspoken grief. And while the royals tried to smother the flames, one figure moved in secret, determined to bring the Queen's final words into the light. It began with a whisper to a tabloid, then a coded message on royal gossip forums, and then the leak. The Queen's final note, scanned and sent in fragments, began surfacing across encrypted servers. Panic surged through Buckingham Palace. Who leaked it, and why now? It wasn't the media that broke the story, it was the internet. First, a single screenshot appeared on a niche Reddit thread known for dissecting royal rumors. The image was grainy, barely legible, but the handwriting and seal were unmistakable. Within hours, pieces of the note began showing up in Telegram groups dedicated to royal intrigue, and then it spread to corners, darker, still private chat rooms, encrypted forums, the digital underground where secrets go viral before they're even verified. The username behind the drops? Q-Truth. No photo, no trace, no prior history. But they had access not to rumors, but to the Queen's own handwriting, scrawled in pain and defiance. One fragment in particular sent shockwaves through the nation. To serve the crown is not to surrender the soul. The phrase was poetic, cutting, and hauntingly final. It struck a nerve across the globe. The message was unmistakable. Elizabeth had seen something coming, and she had not been at peace. Inside the palace, chaos erupted. The note that had been buried, sealed, and silenced was now digital wildfire. Security teams scrambled to shut down links, but it was already too late. Once it hit the open web, there was no undoing it. Damage control turned into desperation. Emergency protocols were enacted, and cyber intelligence operatives were brought in to trace the origin. What they found pointed not outside the palace, but deep within it. All digital breadcrumbs, subtle as they were, led back to a terminated device registered to a former royal aide, someone dismissed quietly just weeks after the Queen's funeral. No formal charges had ever been filed. The public had barely noticed, but now, with every second, the suspicion grew louder. Had they leaked the note out of vengeance? Or had they done what others were too afraid to do, honor the Queen's truth? Charles was reportedly livid. Aides described him as red-faced, pacing furiously, shouting in disbelief. Camilla, insiders say, refused to speak publicly, but privately demanded action. An emergency meeting was convened, not just with senior royals, but with legal teams and crisis managers. The question wasn't just how to stop the leak, it was whether the monarchy could survive what the Queen had left behind. Because what began as a private reckoning was now a public uprising. Commentators, politicians, and citizens alike began calling for transparency. If Elizabeth had written her truth, why had it been hidden? Why had it taken an anonymous source to bring it to light? And while the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, insiders were beginning to whisper of something even more explosive. Not just what had been leaked, but what hadn't. Because buried in the final pages of the Queen's note was a hidden clause, a last request kept from view. And what came next risked shattering the monarchy forever, a secret clause within the note no one was prepared for. Buried at the bottom of the note, in trembling script, lies the Queen's final request: "Let no woman who divided this house wear my crown." a direct challenge to Camilla's title and a clause reportedly ignored. Why was it suppressed? Who made the call to bury it? And what does it mean for the future? The revelation came like a crack of thunder across an already storming sky. The leaked pages of the Queen's note had been enough to ignite a crisis, but it was the final line, allegedly missing from every public and internal copy released to the FA. Millie, that triggered outright fury. The words were simple but impossible to misinterpret. A dying queen, stripped of pageantry and ceremony, made a request, not a suggestion, not a plea but a directive, yet the palace denied it. According to multiple insiders, the clause had been deliberately redacted before the rest of the family ever laid eyes on it. Senior aides claimed it was too inflammatory, too divisive, and worst of all, not legally binding. But legality was never the point. The monarchy was built on more than law. It was built on loyalty, legacy, and moral truth. And to ignore a monarch's dying wish, that wasn't oversight, that was betrayal. Behind palace doors, it sparked a clash few had predicted. Charles, already under pressure, reportedly erupted when confronted with the leak. His team argued that publishing such a line would devastate the image of unity he'd tried desperately to craft. But for William, the issue ran deeper. To him, this wasn't just about protocol. It was about memory, honor, and a promise made to the one person who had held the family together through scandal after scandal. He had read the full note unedited. He knew the clause existed, and now, facing a father determined to press forward with Camilla's coronation, he found himself torn in ways no heir should ever have to be. Private sources claim intense discussions took place, some lasting well into the early hours. William allegedly urged Charles to reconsider, to delay the crowning, to at least publicly acknowledge the Queen's final words. But the response was cold, calculated, and damning. Advisors warned Charles that hesitating would be a sign of weakness. Stability is the priority, one senior figure reportedly told him. The monarchy cannot afford sentiment. But in the rush to maintain appearances, they may have underestimated the storm brewing beyond the palace walls. The public had seen the clause. They had felt its weight. And as whispers of its suppression spread, faith in the monarchy began to fracture. Polls turned. Headlines shifted from celebration to suspicion. Historian after historian weighed in, but one quote captured the nation's mood. "This is the first time a monarch's dying wish was openly defied." The line became a rallying cry, splashed across banners, plastered on social media, whispered in Parliament. The Queen's final act, instead of unifying, had become a symbol of everything the Crown claimed not to be: selective, self-preserving, and capable of silencing even its most revered voice. With the world watching and the Crown teetering on the edge of public faith, one final chapter unfolds not in whispers, but in fire. The coronation was meant to be triumphant. But as Camilla ascended the steps in her royal regalia, protesters lined the streets holding signs that read, "Remember the Queen." Inside the abbey, William's face was unreadable. And then one glance exchanged between father and son changed everything. It should have been the crowning moment of Charles's reign, the final chapter, in a decades-long pursuit of redemption, unity, and image control. But instead, the air was heavy, stained with unspoken tension and a silence louder than the choirs that sang through Westminster. The note, the leak, the clause, none of it had faded. If anything, the closer the day crept, the louder it all became. Camilla's coronation had already been delayed twice under the guise of scheduling conflicts, but insiders knew the truth: resistance. Not from the public alone, but from within the family. Several royals quietly declined to attend rehearsal events. Others withdrew public support. One senior member was overheard calling it an insult in pearls. No one said it aloud, but the message was clear: the key, N's final words, still hung in the air, unresolved and ignored. Polls conducted just days before the ceremony revealed a nation divided. Nearly half of respondents believed Camilla should not wear the title of Queen Consort, citing the leaked note as a moral red line. Headlines began to shift tone. Editorials questioned not the pageantry but the conscience. Commentators pointed to the monarchy's long history of bending tradition but never defying a monarch's dying wish. And all eyes inevitably turned to William. Every step he took was dissected. At every engagement, every expression, speculation followed. but it was his visible distance from Charles in the televised coronation events that ignited the headlines. They stood together, but they did not move in harmony. Not once did they lock eyes until the final moment. Kate's absence from a key pre-coronation dinner sent another ripple through the narrative. No explanation was offered, no apology issued. And yet her absence said more than any statement could. Behind the scenes, rumours spread that she had refused to appear in full royal regalia beside Camilla. Whether for loyalty or protest, no one could say. But it reinforced what many suspected: the unity presented to the cameras was no longer real. It was cracked porcelain, held together by necessity. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man tasked with officiating the ceremony, reportedly expressed his disquiet. Sources say he privately admitted to aides that the Queen's final clause had unsettled him deeply, not just for what it said, but for what it implied had been done to bury it. Yet when the time came, he followed the script. Until Charles, crown in hand, hesitated. It lasted only a second, but it was a second too long. A flicker of uncertainty passed over his face, and in that moment, as the cameras rolled and the world watched, he turned ever so slightly and met William's eyes. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be, because what passed between them was not just hesitation, it was consequence. But the story doesn't end at the coronation, because the Queen's note may have spoken louder than any crown ever could. They tried to silence her. They tried to bury her words. But Queen Elizabeth's final note has become a ghost that haunts the monarchy and a moral compass for the future. Its echoes ripple through corridors of power, and its warning remains: legacy is not in what is kept. It is in what is remembered. The coronation passed, the crown was placed, but the weight of that crown was heavier than anyone could have imagined. Because even as ceremonies continued and speeches were made, the world wasn't talking about the crown, it was talking about the note. In cafes, in classrooms, in Parliament, the Queen's final words became gospel and rebellion all at once. Commentators shifted from loyalty to inquiry. Headlines no longer asked whether the monarchy could modernize. They asked if it could survive its own conscience. E-note had stripped away the myth of perfect succession and exposed something raw beneath, the soul of a monarch, unedited, unfiltered, unforgotten. In the quiet spaces behind the spectacle, William reportedly began chronicling his grandmother's final months. Not through press interviews or memoirs, but in his own private writings. A way to preserve the truth not yet told. Insiders claim he has gathered letters, recordings, and recollections, building a record that may one day serve as a reckoning of its own, a tribute, a shield, or perhaps a time bomb. And while he remains silent, Kate has spoken without saying a word. Appearing at a public charity event just weeks after the coronation, she wore a brooch emerald, diamond-encrusted, known to have belonged to the Queen and worn only once before, during Elizabeth's final official engagement. A coincidence? No, a message, one that didn't need explanation. Even the next generation has felt the tremors. Young royals are reportedly bane. Raised with new protocols, not just etiquette, but ethics. Their education, once rooted in legacy, now leans into truth, transparency, the value of voice over silence. It's a quiet shift, but a powerful one. Because the institution has learned the cost of suppressing a queen's will, and it cannot afford to pay that price again. Meanwhile, the public's view has shifted. Charles's approval, once cautiously optimistic, now struggles beneath the shadow of his mother's final words. And Camilla, elevated in title but battered in public opinion, faces the cold reality of wearing a crown not crowned in love, but controversy. Polls show her approval at record lows, her appearances met with silent judgment, and her legacy already marred by something no ceremony can undo. The note, once hidden, has become a symbol. Not of rebellion, but of reckoning, a voice that could not be buried. A reminder that the true power of a monarch lies not in the crown they wear, but in the truth they leave behind. Elizabeth's final act was not ceremonial, it was spiritual, and its impact will outlast any reign. As the crown marches on into a new era, one thing is clear: the voice of a queen is never truly silenced. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.